On a warm summer afternoon at Brookside Meadows, a well-regarded suburban community, an incident unfolded that would soon ripple throughout the neighborhood and capture public attention. Nina Caldwell, a distinguished black woman and rising state senator, was enjoying a peaceful swim at the community pool. The water shimmered under the sun as she embraced a rare moment of relaxation, far removed from the hectic pace of political life and the relentless demands of public service. Her presence at the pool was simply that of a resident seeking solace and recreation in a place she now called home. However, not everyone shared Nina's serene outlook that day. Alice Monroe, the vigilant and notoriously strict president of the HOA, was patrolling the pool area as part of her routine enforcement of community rules. Known for her micromanagement and inflexible adherence to the rules, Alice had a reputation for scrutinizing even the most mundane activities of her neighbors. That day, her watchful eye fell on Nina, and within moments, her perspective shifted drastically. Alice Monroe, fueled by a mixture of prejudice and an overzealous sense of duty, immediately assumed that Nina did not belong at the community pool. In her mind, the mere sight of a successful black woman enjoying the amenities of Brookside Meadows was enough to justify suspicion. Without a second thought, Alice picked up her phone and dialed 911, reporting that there was an intruder in the pool area, a claim that was entirely unfounded and steeped in bias. She believed that by calling the authorities, she was upholding the community's standards and protecting what she saw as the integrity of Brookside Meadows. As the minutes ticked by, the situation escalated quickly. When the police arrived, they were met with a scene that was both bewildering and disconcerting. There, in the clear light of day, was Nina Caldwell, calmly swimming and clearly enjoying her well-earned break. The officers began their investigation, checking records and verifying the identity of the individual in the pool. It soon became evident that Nina was not only a legitimate resident but also a respected state senator, a fact that rendered Alice Monroe's accusations not only baseless but also ludicrous. The revelation that Nina Caldwell was a state senator sent shockwaves through the community. What had started as a routine day at the pool turned into a public relations debacle, highlighting the deep-seated prejudices that could still pervade even the most modern neighborhoods. The incident raised serious questions about the extent to which personal biases could influence the actions of those in positions of power, and it set the stage for a broader conversation about equality, respect, and accountability in our communities. For Nina, the ordeal was both shocking and disheartening. Here she was, striving to serve the public and advocate for progressive causes like education reform and healthcare access, only to be treated as an outsider in her own community. The incident underscored the challenges she would continue to face, not just as a public figure, but as a woman of color in a society where prejudice still lurked beneath the surface. Thus, what began as a quiet afternoon swim evolved into an incident that exposed the fault lines of bias and injustice. It became a pivotal moment for Brookside Meadows, as residents and leaders alike were forced to confront the uncomfortable reality of discrimination in their midst, and to question the true meaning of community in an era that promised inclusivity but sometimes fell short. In Brookside Meadows, the neighborhood's strict adherence to rules is overseen by none other than Alice Monroe, the longtime president of the HOA. Known for her unyielding and meticulous enforcement of even the most trivial community standards, Alice had earned a reputation for micromanaging every detail of life in our subdivision. Her office, tucked away in the HOA building, was filled with folders documenting every minor infraction, and her watchful eyes seemed to miss nothing. Alice's governing style was authoritarian to the point of being overbearing. She believed that order could only be maintained through constant vigilance, and she took it upon herself to police every aspect of residents' lives, from the height of their hedges to the color of their front door decorations. It wasn't unusual for her to send out stern emails regarding misplaced trash bins or even gently scold residents for having an inappropriate lawn ornament. In her mind, these small details were the building blocks of a respectable community, and she was determined to ensure that everyone adhered to her exacting standards. This strict, almost obsessive enforcement extended to the pool area, a centerpiece of relaxation for Brookside Meadows. For Alice, the pool wasn't just a place for leisure, it was a stage where the rules of the HOA were meant to be performed flawlessly. So when she spotted Nina Caldwell, a prominent new resident and state senator, swimming there, Alice's ingrained suspicion immediately took over. In her eyes, someone like Nina, despite her accomplished status, had no business challenging the established order by using community amenities without her explicit approval. Alice's actions that day were emblematic of her entire tenure. Rather than welcoming Nina with the cordiality expected of a community leader, she viewed the situation through a lens of control and prejudice. To Alice, Nina's presence in the pool was an aberration, a deviation from what she considered acceptable behavior in Brookside Meadows. Fueled by a mix of envy and a deeply rooted bias, Alice swiftly decided that intervention was necessary, so necessary, in fact, that she didn't hesitate to call the police. For Alice Munro, enforcing the rules wasn't just a duty, it was a personal crusade. Every infraction, no matter how minor, was an opportunity to reaffirm her authority and maintain the pristine image of the neighborhood. This unyielding approach, however, came at a cost. It bred an atmosphere of tension and unease among residents, who began to see her as less of a community guardian and more of a tyrant policing every aspect of daily life. Her history of reporting minor infractions and her readiness to involve law enforcement over the slightest deviation had made her infamous. Many whispered that Alice's methods were less about preserving order and more about imposing her own narrow vision of respectability, one that left no room for diversity or differing lifestyles. This was a critical piece of the puzzle, for it set the stage for the confrontation that was about to unfold, a confrontation that would soon expose the true nature of her controlling behavior. In Brookside Meadows, where community spirit should have been nurtured by cooperation and understanding, Alice Munro's iron grip on the rules had become a source of deep-seated resentment. Her actions, especially on that fateful day at the pool, revealed a disturbing willingness to sacrifice fairness for the sake of rigid order. And in doing so, she unwittingly ignited a series of events that would challenge not only her authority but also the very fabric of our community. Nina Caldwell's journey to Brookside Meadows is a story of resilience, ambition, and unwavering commitment to public service. As one of the youngest state senators in North Carolina, Nina has become a rising star in politics, renowned for her steadfast advocacy on issues like education reform, healthcare access, and racial equality. Her career is marked by a determination to create a better future for all, and despite her hectic schedule in the state legislature, she has always found time to engage with her community. Before her meteoric rise in politics, Nina worked tirelessly to overcome numerous obstacles. She grew up in a modest household where hard work was the only path to success. That early life instilled in her a belief that every achievement must be earned through perseverance and dedication. As she navigated the complexities of public service, Nina never lost sight of the values that defined her: integrity, empathy, and a commitment to justice. Seeking a quieter life away from the relentless pressures of state politics, Nina chose Brookside Meadows as her new home. The community promised a peaceful retreat, a place where she could recharge and perhaps even find inspiration for her legislative work. The pool at Brookside Meadows, with its shimmering water and inviting ambience, quickly became one of her favorite spots, a small sanctuary where she could momentarily escape the demands of her public role. Despite her professional success and her progressive ideals, Nina was not immune to the challenges that come with being a visible figure in a predominantly conservative neighborhood. Her arrival at Brookside Meadows stirred mixed reactions among residents, some of whom admired her achievements while others, influenced by outdated biases, viewed her with suspicion. For Nina, the transition to suburban life was both a relief and a challenge. It provided the quiet she needed, but it also exposed her to the harsh realities of prejudice and intolerance. Throughout her career, Nina has been a tireless advocate for social justice. Her legislative record is filled with efforts to improve the lives of marginalized communities, and she has earned respect and admiration far beyond the corridors of government. Yet, in Brookside Meadows, her very presence became a lightning rod for controversy. The same qualities that had propelled her to political success, her intelligence, her determination, and her willingness to stand up for what is right, were met with scorn by some who refused to accept that a black woman could embody success so completely. In choosing Brookside Meadows, Nina sought to build a life defined by peace and purpose. However, she soon found that even in a seemingly tranquil suburban setting, the echoes of bias and prejudice could be impossible to ignore. Her background, filled with trials, triumphs, and an unwavering commitment to bettering society, was both a source of strength and, tragically, a target for those threatened by her success. Nina Caldwell's story is a testament to the power of resilience in the face of adversity. Her journey from humble beginnings to the halls of government has been marked by an unyielding belief in equality and justice. And as she navigates the challenges of life in Brookside Meadows, she remains determined to use her platform to champion the rights of all, proving that true success is measured not just by personal achievements, but by the positive change one brings to the world. Shortly after Nina Caldwell settled into her new home at Brookside Meadows, the atmosphere of cautious optimism was abruptly shattered by her first encounter with the HOA's enforcer, Alice Monroe. This meeting would set a disconcerting tone for Nina's experience in the community, a tone marked by suspicion, rigid control, and a palpable sense of being unwelcome. On the day of her arrival, as Nina was unpacking and getting acquainted with her surroundings, Alice Monroe made her presence known in a manner that felt less like a warm greeting and more like an interrogation. Dressed in a sharply pressed blouse and armed with a clipboard filled with the HOA's extensive list of rules, Alice approached Nina with an unsettling air of authority. The initial conversation was brief, yet its impact was profound. Alice's words were laced with an almost clinical scrutiny. She began by asking detailed questions about Nina's personal belongings, from the colors of her curtains to the arrangement of her furniture, as if every item could reveal whether Nina was a good fit for Brookside Meadows. There was no preamble of welcome or neighborly camaraderie, only a barrage of inquiries that made it clear that the HOA's standards were non-negotiable, and that Nina's every move would be monitored meticulously. The questions quickly shifted from mundane to invasive. Alice insisted on explaining the strict community guidelines that governed everything from landscaping to the proper placement of outdoor decorations. Her tone was both patronizing and imperious, as though she were conducting an audit rather than a casual introduction. For Nina, who had long dreamed of a peaceful, supportive community, this initial interaction was jarring. It conveyed an implicit message, that she, despite her credentials and accomplishments, would always be regarded as an outsider. Throughout the exchange, Nina maintained a calm and respectful demeanor, determined not to let the invasive questioning undermine her sense of self. She answered each query with measured precision, hoping that her responses would allay any concerns about her suitability as a resident of Brookside Meadows. Yet, beneath the surface, a growing unease took hold. The overly policed welcome felt like the prelude to a long series of unwarranted inspections and micromanagement that would define her time in the community. As the conversation drew to a close, Alice left with a final, lingering remark about the importance of following the HOA rules to the letter. Nina was left to ponder the implications of that statement. It wasn't simply a matter of compliance, it was a subtle reminder that in Brookside Meadows, conformity was prized above individuality, and that any deviation from the norm would be met with swift and uncompromising scrutiny. For Nina, the encounter was a stark introduction to the realities of suburban life in Brookside Meadows. The promise of a quiet, supportive environment was tainted by the knowledge that her every move would be subject to the judgment of a community overseen by a micromanaging figure like Alice Monroe. The chill of that first interaction lingered long after Alice had departed, casting a shadow over what should have been a hopeful new beginning. In the days that followed, Nina couldn't shake the feeling of being constantly watched, a sense that the HOA's rules were not merely guidelines but tools of exclusion, wielded with precision against those who dared to be different. The overly scrutinizing welcome had set the stage for the challenges ahead, challenges that would test Nina's resolve and force her to confront not only bureaucratic rigidity but also the more insidious forms of bias and control. Yet, even in the face of such an unwelcome reception, Nina resolved to stand firm. Her vision for a better future, one built on equality, respect, and the celebration of diversity, remained unshaken. The encounter with Alice Monroe, as cold and disconcerting as it was, only strengthened her determination to carve out a space for herself in Brookside Meadows and to challenge the narrow confines of a community that prized conformity over compassion. In the weeks that followed that chilling first interaction, the tension between Nina Caldwell and the HOA began to simmer and gradually escalate. What initially appeared as an isolated incident soon unfolded into a relentless campaign of scrutiny and passive-aggressive enforcement by Alice Monroe, whose every move seemed designed to unsettle Nina and remind her of her outsider status. Every day brought a new challenge to Nina's peace of mind. Alice, ever vigilant in her duties, began to cast a wide net of observations, meticulously noting even the smallest deviations from the HOA's stringent guidelines. It started with a series of seemingly minor infractions. A hedge trimmed a few inches too short here, a trash bin left slightly askew there. Each time, Nina received a curt email from the HOA outlining the violation in exacting detail, accompanied by a reminder of the community's standards. At first, Nina attempted to overlook these infractions. She rationalized that adjustments could be made, that perhaps it was simply the way things were done in Brookside Meadows. However, as the months progressed, it became painfully clear that this was not a matter of isolated incidents but part of a calculated effort by Alice Monroe to enforce a rigid conformity that left no room for individuality. The emails grew more frequent and the tone increasingly accusatory, turning every small aspect of Nina's home life into a battleground. The escalation reached a fever pitch during a particularly hot summer. The HOA's vigilance seemed to take on an almost personal quality. Alice's messages became more pointed, laced with subtle digs that hinted at Nina's unsuitability for the community. The very aesthetic of Nina's home, the carefully curated art on the walls, the vibrant colors she chose to express her personality, was subjected to scrutiny. Neighbors, too, began to echo Alice's concerns, sometimes out of genuine belief, sometimes out of the fear of attracting the HOA's wrath. The atmosphere grew heavy with unspoken judgment and a palpable sense of exclusion. For Nina, each email and each pointed remark added to a growing sense of isolation. What was meant to be a place of refuge and quiet ambition was turning into a controlled environment where every action was measured against an unforgiving standard. The stress of constantly having to prove her right to belong, of having her every detail inspected and critiqued, began to take its toll. She found herself spending more time addressing trivial complaints than enjoying the home she had worked so hard to achieve. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that the underlying tone of the HOA's communications was not merely about maintaining order, it was steeped in a subtle, yet unmistakable, bias. The criticisms often carried an unspoken implication that Nina, despite her success and accomplishments, did not quite fit the mold of what was considered acceptable in Brookside Meadows. This notion was as corrosive as it was demoralizing, undermining her confidence and casting a shadow over her achievements. As the escalation continued, Nina was forced to confront the reality that the battle was not just for compliance with rules, but for the very respect and recognition of her identity. What had begun as a series of petty infractions had morphed into a sustained campaign of harassment, a campaign that sought to strip her of the dignity she had worked so hard to attain. Each new complaint was a reminder that in the eyes of the HOA, and particularly in the meticulous gaze of Alice Monroe, Nina's success was an affront to an outdated standard of community living. In the midst of this relentless pressure, Nina resolved to document every incident. She kept detailed records of the emails, noted the times and dates of each infraction, and even shared her experiences with a few trusted neighbors. The process of documentation not only provided a measure of control in an otherwise chaotic situation but also helped her realize that her struggle was not hers alone. Other residents, too, were beginning to question the fairness of the HOA's policies and the bias that seemed to underpin them. This period of escalating tension was a crucible for Nina, a test of her resolve, her patience, and her unwavering commitment to stand up for her rights. The mounting hostility, though deeply painful, also galvanized her determination to push back against the forces that sought to diminish her. In Brookside Meadows, where conformity was enforced at all costs, Nina's fight became a battle for inclusion, dignity, and the right to celebrate one's individuality without fear of constant judgment. The long, tension-filled summer at Brookside Meadows reached its breaking point on an otherwise ordinary afternoon at the community pool, a space meant for relaxation and rejuvenation. For Nina Caldwell, the pool had quickly become a cherished retreat from the oppressive atmosphere that had been building in her home. It was a place where she could momentarily escape the constant scrutiny and hostility that had plagued her since moving in. However, that day, the pool would become the stage for a dramatic confrontation that would further unravel the fragile veneer of peace in the community. Nina had just finished a refreshing swim when she noticed a figure approaching the poolside. It was Alice Monroe, the ever-watchful HOA president, whose reputation for relentless rule enforcement had preceded her. This time, Alice's demeanor was even more intense than usual. With a furrowed brow and a clipboard clutched tightly in her hand, she strode toward Nina, her eyes fixed on every detail of the senator's appearance and behavior. In a tone that was both accusatory and imperious, Alice began to interrogate Nina about her presence at the pool. She questioned whether Nina, given her background and recent run-ins with the HOA, was even allowed to use the facility. The questioning was invasive and carried an air of suspicion that bordered on hostility. Nina, who had grown accustomed to the constant barrage of micromanagement from Alice, attempted to defuse the situation with calm dignity. She explained that as a resident of Brookside Meadows, she was fully entitled to use the pool, just as any other member of the community. But Alice's suspicion was not so easily assuaged. Despite Nina's composed explanation, Alice's gaze remained fixed and unyielding. The tension in the air grew thick, and a small crowd of onlookers began to gather, drawn by the escalating drama. For Nina, this encounter was more than a routine interaction, it was a public spectacle that underscored the deep-seated prejudice underlying Alice's behavior. Here, at the pool, the clash was not just about community rules, it was about whether a black state senator could claim her rightful space without being subjected to relentless scrutiny. Alice's tone grew more vehement as she reiterated her unfounded suspicions. She accused Nina of flaunting her status and hinted that her presence was somehow an affront to the established order of Brookside Meadows. Each word dripped with condescension and a veiled implication that Nina did not belong, a sentiment that stung deeply. Despite the injustice of the accusations, Nina maintained her composure, choosing instead to focus on the calm rhythm of the water around her. A reminder of the peace she sought, even in the midst of hostility. Yet, as the confrontation wore on, it became evident that Alice's suspicions were far from a momentary lapse. The HOA president's fixation on Nina's presence was part of a broader pattern of behavior that had been building for weeks. The pool incident, though it might have appeared minor in isolation, represented the culmination of a relentless campaign of microaggressions and unwarranted oversight. For Nina, every such encounter chipped away at the sense of belonging she had hoped to nurture in her new home. As voices rose and the crowd's murmurs intensified, the situation teetered on the edge of chaos. Nina's attempts to assert her right to enjoy the community pool were met with a barrage of condescending remarks and pointed looks that spoke volumes about the intolerance underlying Alice's actions. In that fraught moment, the pool, once a symbol of solace, transformed into a battleground where the struggle for respect and dignity played out before the eyes of an entire community. Eventually, as tensions reached a fever pitch, the situation seemed poised to escalate further. But even as the confrontation grew more heated, Nina's inner resolve hardened. She knew that this public debacle was not merely about her use of a pool, it was a manifestation of the broader societal battle against prejudice and authoritarian control. With quiet determination, she braced herself for whatever might come next, resolved to stand firm in her rights and to challenge the bias that had so long sought to diminish her. The simmering tension at the pool quickly escalated when Alice Monroe, unable to contain her suspicions any longer, made a drastic decision: she called the police. In a matter of moments, what had begun as an uncomfortable, albeit civil, confrontation transformed into a full-blown crisis. The call to law enforcement was intended, in Alice's mind, to serve as the ultimate enforcement of Brookside Meadows' rigid rules. Instead, it marked a turning point that would expose the absurdity of her actions. When the police arrived, their presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. Officers, clad in their uniforms and armed with an air of professionalism, began to take control of the situation. They questioned both Nina Caldwell and Alice Monroe, seeking to ascertain the facts behind the heated exchange at the pool. It wasn't long before the officers discovered that the root of the conflict was not any legitimate violation of community guidelines but rather Alice's unfounded and prejudiced suspicions about Nina's right to be there. As the officers conducted their inquiry, Nina maintained her composure, calmly explaining that she was a resident of Brookside Meadows with every legal right to use the pool. She presented her identification and other documentation without hesitation, underscoring the legitimacy of her presence. In stark contrast, Alice's account grew increasingly inconsistent. The officers quickly noted that her accusations bore no basis in fact, and her demeanor shifted from one of stern authority to visible frustration and embarrassment. The situation took on an almost surreal quality as the officers, while fulfilling their duty, inadvertently highlighted the underlying prejudice that had fueled the incident. Neighbors who had gathered around watched in a mix of shock and quiet satisfaction as the truth began to surface. The police's routine checks and the verification of Nina's credentials left little doubt that her use of the pool was entirely proper. In a matter of minutes, what had started as a personal confrontation was transformed into a public debacle exposing the inherent bias in Alice Munro's actions. For Nina, the arrival of the police was both a vindication and a painful reminder of the challenges she faced in asserting her rightful place in the community. The officers' confirmation of her identity and legal status served as a powerful rebuke to Alice's unfounded claims. It was a moment when the scales of justice tipped in favor of truth, and the absurdity of the accusations became undeniable. Yet, even as the police concluded their investigation and prepared to leave, the impact of the incident resonated deeply. The spectacle of a state senator being harassed over her presence at the pool, and the subsequent revelation that the entire episode was driven by baseless prejudice, sent shockwaves through Brookside Meadows. It forced residents to confront the uncomfortable reality that discrimination could manifest in the most unexpected places, even under the guise of enforcing community rules. In the aftermath, as the officers departed and the crowd slowly dispersed, Nina was left with a mixture of relief and lingering sorrow. The incident had exposed not only the pettiness of Alice Munro's authoritarian rule but also the broader issues of bias and intolerance that still pervaded society. For Nina, the police involvement was a turning point, a moment that underscored the importance of standing up for one's rights and demanding accountability from those in positions of power. With the truth now clearly laid bare, Nina resolved that this experience would not break her spirit. Instead, it would serve as a catalyst for her continued advocacy for equality and justice. The memory of that day, with its mix of chaos and clarity, would fuel her determination to transform Brookside Meadows into a community where every resident could live free from the shadow of prejudice and authoritarian overreach. News of the incident at Brookside Meadows spread quickly, and the fallout from the pool confrontation ignited widespread public outcry. As word reached local media outlets and community social platforms, residents began to voice their disbelief and indignation over the treatment Nina Caldwell had received. Headlines quickly emerged, condemning the actions of Alice Munro and questioning the fairness of the HOA's enforcement practices. Public sentiment was swift and strong. Nina's ordeal resonated deeply with many, particularly those who had experienced or witnessed subtle forms of discrimination in their own lives. Community members rallied behind Nina, sharing her story widely and calling for accountability from the HOA leadership. Social media became a forum for solidarity, where hashtags championing fairness and inclusion trended locally, and supporters praised Nina for her dignified response in the face of blatant prejudice. Local activists and community leaders joined the chorus of voices demanding change. They argued that the incident was not an isolated occurrence but a symptom of a larger problem, an environment where arbitrary rules were weaponized to marginalize those who did not conform to a narrow definition of acceptable behavior. The public outcry forced the HOA to confront a harsh reality, that their policies and the actions of their president were out of step with the values of many residents. Nina, meanwhile, handled the attention with grace. In interviews with journalists, she recounted her experience without bitterness, emphasizing the need for greater understanding and respect among neighbors. Her measured, thoughtful responses only added to the public's admiration, and she soon became a symbol of resilience and integrity. As the media coverage intensified, calls for reform grew louder. Community meetings were held, and residents expressed their support for new, more inclusive policies that would ensure fairness and accountability within Brookside Meadows. The collective demand for change marked a significant turning point, one that signaled the beginning of a broader movement to root out discrimination in all its forms. In the midst of this public awakening, the incident that had once seemed like an isolated attack transformed into a catalyst for community-wide change. The voices of the many drowned out the narrow-mindedness of a few, and Brookside Meadows began to emerge as a community determined to uphold values of equality and justice. The public outcry, fueled by the courage of one woman's experience, promised a brighter future for all who called the neighborhood home. Faced with overwhelming community pressure and the relentless scrutiny of her actions, Alice Monroe, once the iron-fisted president of the HOA at Brookside Meadows, found herself compelled to address the controversy head-on. At a specially convened community meeting, Alice stepped up to the podium, visibly unsettled, as residents gathered to demand accountability for the events that had unfolded at the pool. In her apology, Alice attempted to express regret for the distress caused by her actions. She acknowledged that her enforcement of the community rules might have come across as overly strict, but she struggled to offer a satisfactory explanation for her deep-seated biases. The meeting was charged with emotion, and many in attendance were less interested in hearing vague promises than in seeing tangible steps taken to ensure that such discriminatory behavior would never be repeated. For many residents, Alice's apology felt hollow, a mere formality that failed to address the real harm inflicted upon Nina Caldwell and, by extension, the community. The discussion quickly turned to the issue of accountability. Neighbors recounted similar instances of unwarranted policing by the HOA, and it became clear that Alice's behavior was part of a broader pattern of exclusion and intolerance. As the meeting progressed, a vote of no confidence was proposed by community members who demanded change. The atmosphere was electric with a collective resolve to root out discrimination from the very heart of Brookside Meadows. When the vote was finally cast, the result was resounding. Alice Monroe was recalled from her position as HOA president. Her departure was met with a mix of relief and cautious optimism, relief that a long-standing source of tension was finally being removed, and optimism that the community could begin to heal and rebuild trust. In the aftermath of the recall, many residents expressed hope that this dramatic turn of events would mark the beginning of a new era, one in which fairness, transparency, and mutual respect would replace the heavy-handed enforcement of outdated rules. For Nina Caldwell, the recall was not just a personal vindication but a symbol of the community's commitment to stand against discrimination and to support those who are targeted by prejudice. While Alice attempted to offer further apologies in private, the public sentiment was clear: actions, not words, were needed to restore harmony. The recall sent a powerful message that leadership in Brookside Meadows must be held to the highest standards, and that no one is above accountability. In that pivotal moment, the community reaffirmed its belief that every resident deserves to feel safe, respected, and valued, regardless of their background or achievements. In the wake of Alice Monroe's recall, Brookside Meadows began a remarkable transformation. What had once been a community overshadowed by strict, exclusionary policies was now taking bold steps toward inclusivity and mutual respect. The dramatic events, sparked by the unjust treatment of Nina Caldwell, had opened a dialogue about fairness, accountability, and the need to embrace diversity. In the months following the recall, the HOA underwent significant restructuring. New leadership, committed to transparency and fairness, took the helm and introduced policies designed to prevent the misuse of authority and to foster a more welcoming environment for all residents. Among these changes were the implementation of more flexible guidelines, regular community forums, and initiatives aimed at encouraging dialogue between neighbors. The goal was clear: to build a community where every individual, regardless of race or background, could thrive. Nina Caldwell emerged as a key figure in this transformation. Far from being merely a victim of prejudice, she became an advocate for change, a beacon of resilience whose experience underscored the need for reform. She worked closely with the new HOA board to help draft policies that balanced order with compassion, ensuring that no one would ever again be subject to the kind of arbitrary scrutiny that had defined the past. Nina also spearheaded mentorship programs and community-building activities that celebrated diversity and promoted unity. Residents, inspired by the tangible shifts in leadership and policy, began to see Brookside Meadows in a new light. The conversations that once revolved around minor infractions gave way to discussions about shared values, cultural exchange, and collective growth. Neighbors from different backgrounds forged new friendships and alliances, and the community slowly healed from the wounds inflicted by past injustices. The transformation was not instantaneous, and challenges remained, but the overall direction was unmistakable. Brookside Meadows was evolving from a place marked by rigid control and subtle prejudice into a vibrant, inclusive community where success and diversity were celebrated. The incident at the pool, once a source of division and heartache, had catalyzed a movement for change, a movement that promised to leave a lasting legacy for future generations. As the community embraced this new chapter, Nina Caldwell's story became a powerful symbol of hope and progress. Her courage in the face of discrimination, her unwavering commitment to justice, and her active role in reshaping the neighborhood served as an inspiration to many. In standing up against hate and demanding accountability, she not only reclaimed her dignity but also paved the way for a more equitable future. In the end, Brookside Meadows emerged stronger and more unified. A testament to the fact that even in the face of deep-seated prejudice, change is possible when a community comes together with a shared vision of respect and inclusivity.